The neighbors always complimented my wife. They just stopped looking me in the eye. Section 1. The dinner party, where I stopped being included. The ice cubes hit the bottom of my crystal glass with a sharp, hollow sound. It was the only sound I truly belonged to in that room. Across the marble kitchen island, Stephanie Collins was laughing, her hand resting briefly on my wife's forearm. It was a practiced gesture. It was the kind of touch that signaled entry into an inner sanctum, a place where I was no longer being invited. I watched the condensation form on my glass, feeling the cold seep into my palm. I was standing exactly 3 feet away from the center of the conversation, yet I might as well have been standing on the moon. Lauren looked radiant. That was the word everyone used for her in Oak Ridge. Radiant. It was a suburban code for profitable and socially compliant. She had this way of tilting her head when Andrew Collins spoke, a gesture of curated attention that made men feel more important than they actually were. I realized, in that moment, that my presence was becoming an inconvenience to the narrative they were building. I wasn't the protagonist of my own life anymore. I was the background noise in a very expensive room, a shadow that didn't quite match the person standing there. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how long it would take for them to notice I hadn't spoken. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They talked about the upcoming charity gala, the fluctuations in the local real estate market, and the new country club membership tiers. Every time I opened my mouth to contribute a thought, Stephanie would pivot. She would ask Lauren a question that required a long, detailed answer. It was surgical. It was a masterclass in social displacement, performed with a smile that never reached her eyes. That was the moment I understood the new hierarchy of the neighborhood. In the world of Oak Ridge, status wasn't just about what you owned. It was about who allowed you to speak. Andrew Collins caught my eye for a split second, then immediately looked down at his watch. It wasn't that he was busy. He was signaling that my time had no value in this specific circle. I felt the psychological weight of it, a cold pressure in my chest that told me the rules had changed while I was busy living my life. I was being phased out of my own social existence. I watched Lauren navigate the room with a grace that felt increasingly foreign to me. She was speaking their language, a dialect of subtle exclusions and reinforced boundaries. When she finally looked at me, there was no recognition of the silence I was enduring. There was only a faint, flickering concern that I wasn't performing well enough for the group. I realized then that Lauren wasn't just a guest at this party. She was the prize they were all competing for, and I was merely the person holding the leash on her time. The Harpers arrived late, bringing with them a fresh wave of energy that pushed me even further toward the periphery. David Harper gave me a nod that felt like a pitying pat on the head. Emily Harper didn't even look my way. She went straight for Lauren, complimenting her dress in a tone that suggested she was surprised I had the taste to help her pick it out. The air in the room felt thin. I stood by the sliding glass doors, looking out at the perfectly manicured lawn, wondering when my home had turned into a stage where I was the only one without a script. I noticed the way the lighting in the kitchen favored the women, casting a soft, angelic glow on their faces, while the men stood in the sharper, harsher shadows of the hallway. It felt intentional. Everything in this house was intentional. Stephanie's choice of appetizers, the volume of the low-tempo jazz, the way the seating was arranged to facilitate specific clusters of power. I was a cluster of one. I stayed in that shadow, watching the reflections of my friends in the darkened glass of the patio doors, realizing that none of them were actually my friends. The silence I maintained wasn't a choice anymore. It was a strategy. I wanted to see the full extent of the map they had drawn. If I didn't push back, if I didn't demand to be heard, where would they stop? I watched Andrew lean in closer to Lauren to show her something on his phone. The proximity was deliberate. It was a test of my boundaries, a way of seeing if the husband still had any teeth. I didn't move. I didn't react. I simply memorized the tilt of his shoulders and the way Lauren laughed a second too long. As the night wore on, the exclusion became more overt. When the group moved to the dining room, the place cards were already set. Lauren was seated between Andrew and David. I was placed at the far end of the table, next to a large vase of lilies that partially obscured my view of the rest of the guests. It was a visual metaphor so blunt it was almost comical. I sat down, the scent of the lilies cloying and thick in the air, feeling the weight of every unsaid word. The perfect marriage we projected was the only thing keeping me in the room, but it was also the very thing they were trying to dismantle. I looked down at my plate, the fine china shimmering under the chandelier. I realized that my silence wasn't weakness, it was a mirror. By not engaging, I was forcing them to show me exactly who they were. I was collecting data while they were busy performing for one another. The social pressure was rising, a silent tide that threatened to drown me if I made one wrong move. But as I picked up my fork, I felt a strange, cold clarity. I knew something they didn't. I knew exactly when the dinner party had actually ended and the real game had begun. Section 2. Compliments that felt like measurements. The following morning, the suburban silence of Oak Ridge felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a Sunday, it was the heavy, expectant silence of a courtroom. I stood on my front porch, watching the morning mist cling to the hedges. Lauren was already out, likely at the Pilates studio with Stephanie. She had left before I woke up, leaving only a faint scent of expensive perfume and a half-empty cup of cold coffee. I picked up the newspaper from the driveway, feeling the eyes of the neighborhood on my back, though no one was visible. David Harper was the first one I saw. He was washing his SUV 3 houses down, the rhythmic spray of the hose the only sound on the street. When I raised a hand in a casual wave, he paused for a beat too long. He didn't wave back with his usual enthusiasm. Instead, he gave a short, stiff nod and went back to his work. It was a measurement. He was measuring the current value of my social stock after the previous night's performance. In this neighborhood, you were only as relevant as your last interaction, and I had been a ghost. I walked to the end of the driveway, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. I realized that the compliments people gave Lauren were no longer just about her. They were becoming weapons used against me. Whenever a neighbor saw us together, they would rave about her latest project or her incredible energy, then turn to me with a look of mild confusion, as if they were wondering why I was still in the frame. It was a slow burn humiliation, designed to make me feel redundant in my own life. I stayed silent because I wanted to hear the exact phrasing they used. Later that afternoon, I ran into Emily Harper at the local market. She spent 5 minutes telling me how lucky I was to have Lauren, her voice dripping with a calculated kind of pity. "She's the heart of our little circle, Michael," she said, her eyes scanning my face for a reaction. "We all just adore her." She didn't say that they didn't adore me. She didn't say that they didn't adore me. She didn't have to. The omission was the entire point. She was measuring my reaction to being sidelined. That was the moment I understood that the neighborhood viewed our marriage as a hierarchy, not a partnership. In their eyes, Lauren was the asset, and I was the liability that came attached to it. They were testing the strength of the bond, looking for cracks where they could insert their influence. I smiled politely, thanked her for the kind words, and moved on. My lack of defensiveness seemed to bother her. She expected me to lean in, to justify my place, to perform for her. By refusing to do so, I was becoming an anomaly they couldn't quite categorize. Social imbalance is a quiet thing in the suburbs. It doesn't happen with a shout. It happens with a seating arrangement, a missed invitation, or a tone of voice. I noticed that when I spoke to Andrew about business, he would answer with vague, dismissive platitudes, as if I wouldn't understand the complexities of his world. He was trying to establish a status threat, positioning himself as the alpha of our small, manicured territory. I stayed calm, watching him carefully, noting the insecurity behind his forced confidence. He needed me to feel small so he could feel large. I realized that my endurance was being interpreted as ignorance. They thought I didn't see the game being played. They thought I was the oblivious husband, content to live in the shadow of his radiant wife. This perception was my greatest advantage. While they were busy underestimating me, I was observing the delicate web of alliances that held Oak Ridge together. I saw who owed Stephanie favors, who was struggling with their mortgage but buying a new Porsche, and who was looking for an escape. I was the invisible man, and the invisible man sees everything. Pressure must increase, never stabilize. That is the rule of the social squeeze. At the neighborhood barbecue that weekend, the exclusion became a physical reality. I was left out of the circle around the grill. When I approached, the conversation would hit a momentary snag, then restart on a topic I had no part in. I stood there with a plate of food I didn't want, feeling the hot sun on my neck, realizing that this was a coordinated effort. Stephanie was the conductor, and the rest of the neighborhood was her orchestra. I stayed silent because I was fascinated by the mechanics of it. They were using Lauren as a shield. They would surround her with attention, making it impossible for me to reach her without appearing desperate or intrusive. I watched my wife enjoy the spotlight, unaware or perhaps fully aware that she was being used to erase me. The psychological pressure was immense. It was the feeling of being erased while you were still standing there. But I didn't break. I didn't even look uncomfortable. I simply adjusted my watch and waited for the right opening. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the grass, Andrew Collins walked over to me. He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and grilled meat. "You're a quiet guy, Michael," he said, his voice low, almost intimate. "Sometimes I wonder what's actually going on in that head of yours, or if anything is going on at all." It was the most direct challenge yet. He was smiling, but his eyes were hard, searching for a sign of weakness, a spark of anger he could use against me. I looked him directly in the eye, my face a mask of calm, and I said nothing for a full 5 seconds. "I'm just a good listener, Andrew," I finally replied, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "You'd be surprised what people say when they think no one is paying attention." The smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. It was the first time I had pushed back, and I did it with the smallest possible lever. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in months. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but a sudden, sharp realization that he didn't actually know who I was. I left him standing there and walked toward Lauren, who was being toasted by the group. I didn't join the circle. I stood just outside it, catching her eye for a brief moment. She looked away first. That was the most important measurement of the day. The social pressure was reaching its boiling point, and the lines had been drawn. As we walked back to our house in the twilight, the silence between us was no longer comfortable. It was heavy with the weight of things noticed and things ignored. I realized then that the next invitation I received wouldn't be for a party. It would be for a reckoning. Section 3. What changes when you arrive alone? The invitation to the charity auction at the country club was sent only to Lauren's email. I knew this because I had checked the server logs on our home office computer. It wasn't a glitch. It was a statement. On the night of the event, Lauren claimed she had to go early to help Stephanie with the silent auction setup. She wore a dress that cost more than some people's cars, kissed my cheek with a cold, distracted precision, and left me in a house that felt too large for one person. I didn't protest. I didn't offer to drive her. I waited exactly 45 minutes, straightened my tie in the mirror, and drove myself. Arriving alone at the Oak Ridge Country Club is like stepping onto a stage where the other actors have already decided your character is dead. The valet took my keys with a look of mild surprise. He was used to seeing the Reeves power couple arrive in a unified front. Walking through those heavy oak doors without Lauren by my side felt like stripping off a layer of armor. I realized that without her, I was no longer a person to them. I was a curiosity. I was a loose thread in their perfectly woven tapestry. I stayed silent as I entered the ballroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the hum of 100 high-stakes conversations. I didn't look for Lauren immediately. Instead, I walked to the bar and ordered a neat scotch. I watched the room through the reflection in the polished back bar mirror. I saw Stephanie Collins notice me from across the room. She leaned in and whispered something to Andrew, whose eyes immediately darted toward me. They didn't wave. They didn't smile. They observed me like a biologist looks at a specimen that has behaved unexpectedly. That was the moment I understood the true function of the +1 in suburban society. It isn't about companionship. It's about containment. By arriving alone, I had broken the containment. I was a free agent in a room where every alliance was strictly choreographed. I felt the social pressure rising, a physical heat at the back of my neck. People I had known for 5 years suddenly found their drinks very interesting when I walked past. They weren't just ignoring me, they were practicing for a world where I no longer existed. I moved through the crowd with a slow, deliberate pace. I didn't seek out conversation. I didn't try to mingle. I simply occupied space. It was a quiet form of psychological warfare. If I acted like I belonged there, even without the social shield of my wife, it forced them to acknowledge my individual weight. I noticed David Harper watching me from the buffet line. He looked uncomfortable. He was used to me being the quiet shadow behind Lauren's bright light. Seeing the shadow move independently was unsettling for him. I realized that my presence was forcing them to reveal their hand. When you are part of a couple, people hide their true opinions behind the veil of couple talk. When you are alone, the mask slips. I saw a group of younger wives near the silent auction tables glance at me and then giggle, a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the jazz music. They weren't laughing at a joke, they were laughing at the perceived fall of a man they thought was already beaten. I stayed silent because their laughter was a gift. It told me exactly where the bottom of the social pit was located. The psychological pressure of the room began to concentrate. It's a strange thing to be in a room of friends and realize you are the only one not in on the secret. Every hushed conversation seemed to be about me. Every glance seemed to be a measurement of my endurance. I took a sip of my scotch, the burn, a welcome distraction from the coldness of the room. I felt a strange sense of liberation. When you have nothing left to lose in a social hierarchy, you gain a terrifying kind of power. You become unpredictable. I saw Lauren finally. She was standing with the Harpers and the Collins, looking every bit the Queen of Oak Ridge. She saw me, and for a split second, I saw a flash of genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't fear for me. It was fear of me. I had disrupted her narrative. I was supposed to be at home, brooding or oblivious. By showing up, I was forcing her to account for me in front of the people she was trying to impress. I didn't walk over to her. I simply raised my glass in a silent toast and stayed exactly where I was. I noticed how the circle around her tightened. It was a defensive formation. Andrew stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle physical claim. He was showing the room that he was the protector of the radiant Lauren Reeves, while her husband stood alone by the bar. It was a status threat, plain and simple. He wanted to see if I would come over and play the part of the supplicant, begging for entry into their circle. I didn't. I stayed in my own circle of one, watching the play unfold with the detachment of a critic. The night wore on, and the isolation only deepened. But something else was happening. By not engaging, by not reacting to the slights, I was becoming the most interesting thing in the room. People were whispering, wondering why I looked so calm. Why wasn't I angry? Why wasn't I trying to win them back? I realized that silence, when maintained under pressure, looks a lot like competence. It looks like you know something they don't. And in a neighborhood built on information and leverage, that is the ultimate threat. As the auction ended and people began to drift toward the exits, the air felt charged. I hadn't spoken more than 10 words all night. I walked toward the valet stand at the same time as the Collins group. The silence was deafening. Stephanie looked like she wanted to say something, her mouth twitching with a suppressed insult. Andrew just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the quiet guy to finally snap. I simply nodded to the valet, tipped him generously, and waited for my car. Just as my car pulled up, Lauren stepped away from the group and walked toward me. She looked like she was about to deliver a rehearsed speech about why she couldn't find me all night. I didn't give her the chance. I opened my car door, looked at her for a long moment, and said, "The auction was successful, Lauren. Everyone showed their true value tonight." I didn't wait for her response. I drove away, leaving her standing under the bright lights of the portico, realizing that the man she thought she had silenced was the only one who had truly heard everything. Section 4. I noticed who spoke for me when I wasn't there. In the weeks following the country club event, the exclusion transitioned from passive to active. I was no longer just the quiet husband. I was a topic of conversation that needed to be managed. I began to hear echoes of these conversations through the thin walls of our social lives. It started at the local coffee shop, where I sat in a high-backed booth that obscured my view. A few minutes after I sat down, I heard Emily Harper and another woman from the neighborhood committee take the table behind me. They didn't know I was there. "It's just so sad for Lauren," Emily whispered, her voice carrying that false suburban empathy that is more toxic than any direct insult. "She tries so hard to keep up appearances, but Michael is becoming difficult. He's so withdrawn. Andrew thinks he's having some kind of midlife crisis, or worse, that he's just given up." I stayed silent because I wanted to hear the narrative they were constructing. They weren't just talking about me, they were rewriting my history. They were turning my restraint into a mental health issue to justify their own cruelty. I realized that Emily was speaking for me in my absence. She was providing the reason for my silence, a reason that made her and her friends feel superior. "Lauren told Stephanie that he doesn't even talk at dinner anymore," the other woman added, her voice full of judgmental relish. "Can you imagine? Living with a ghost? She's too good for him, honestly. She's always been the one with the real potential." That was the moment I understood the depth of the betrayal. My wife wasn't just letting them talk, she was feeding them the ammunition. This was a coordinated effort to devalue my social currency to zero. If they could convince everyone that I was broken or unstable, then any truth I might eventually tell would be dismissed as the ramblings of a bitter man. It was a preemptive strike. I sat there, the cold remains of my coffee in front of me, feeling the psychological pressure of 1,000 invisible eyes. They wanted me to feel like a prisoner in my own skin. But as I listened, I felt a strange, cold power growing. They were talking about a man who didn't exist. They were fighting a shadow. I noticed who didn't speak up for me. David Harper was there later that day at the gym. We were in the locker room, and a few of the other guys were making jokes about the quietest man in Oak Ridge. David, who I had helped with his business taxes just a year ago, laughed along with them. He didn't defend me. He didn't even try to change the subject. He was choosing the winning side. Status is a zero-sum game in this world, and David was making sure he wasn't standing too close to the person being liquidated. Internal monologue. I stayed silent because I was learning the price of their loyalty. It was remarkably cheap. I realized that their respect was never earned. It was merely leased, and the lease was up. I watched David in the mirror as he adjusted his expensive workout gear. He looked like a man who was afraid of being noticed. He was performing for the other men in the room, showing them that he was one of the strong ones. I realized that his loud laughter was just a way to drown out his own insecurity. I felt a wave of calm wash over me. I was the only one in the room who didn't need to perform. The pressure continued to rise as the neighborhood's annual progressive dinner approached. This was the pinnacle of the social season, where groups moved from house to house for different courses. We were traditionally the hosts for the main course. This year, however, the email chain went silent. Then a revised schedule was sent out. We were moved to the appetizer round, the least prestigious slot, the one that meant people would only be in our home for 20 minutes before moving on to the real party at the Collins. I didn't complain to Lauren. I didn't ask why the change happened. I simply watched her try to explain it away with a series of transparent lies. Stephanie thought it would be easier for us this year, Michael, since you've been so stressed. She used that word like a weapon. I stayed silent, looking at her until she had to turn her gaze away. She was losing her ability to lie to me effectively. My silence was a mirror she couldn't stand to look into. She needed me to argue so she could feel like the victim. By saying nothing, I was forcing her to hold the weight of her own deception. I noticed that when Lauren spoke for me in public now, she used a tone of exaggerated patience. At a neighborhood block meeting, someone asked about my firm's recent merger. Before I could speak, Lauren jumped in. "Oh, Michael is taking a back seat on that one," she said, patting my hand condescendingly. "He's focusing on internal matters." The room went quiet for a beat. It was a public execution of my professional reputation. She was signaling to the neighborhood that I was no longer a player. I didn't correct her. I just smiled at the person who asked the question. The psychological dominance I was cultivating was invisible to them. They thought they were winning because they were controlling the noise. But I was controlling the signal. I began to subtly withdraw my support from the hidden structures of the neighborhood. I quietly resigned from the HOA Finance Committee without a word. I moved my personal accounts to a private bank in the city. I began to document everything: the missed invitations, the recorded conversations, the financial shifts. I was building a fortress of facts while they were building a palace of rumors. As we prepared for the appetizer round of the progressive dinner, the atmosphere in our house was electric with tension. Lauren was frantic, trying to make the house look perfect for the 20 minutes of scrutiny we were about to receive. I stood in the kitchen, watching her rearrange the hors d'oeuvres for the 10th time. She was terrified of what people would say if everything wasn't flawless. She was a slave to the very people she thought she was leading. I realized then that she was more of a victim of this system than I was. I at least knew I was in a war. She thought she was just winning a pageant. The doorbell rang. The first group arrived, led by Andrew and Stephanie. They walked into my home with the air of inspectors visiting a failing factory. They spoke loudly, filled the space with forced laughter, and treated me like a ghost. I stood by the wine decanter, pouring drinks with a steady hand. I noticed how they avoided looking at the art on the walls or the books on the shelves. They didn't want to see the man who lived here. They only wanted to see the failure they had agreed. I was Andrew leaned against my kitchen counter, looking at me with a smirk. Nice spread, Michael. A bit modest, isn't it? He was looking for a reaction. He wanted me to defend my home, my status, my life. I looked at him, then at the wine in his glass. It's exactly what the occasion deserves, Andrew, I said quietly. The smirk didn't leave his face, but his grip on the glass tightened. He didn't know how to handle a man who didn't care about his insults. As the group began to move toward the door for the next house, I felt a quiet satisfaction. They were leaving, but the pressure was staying behind.
And I was the only one who knew how to breathe in it.
Section 5. Silence becomes a filter. The silence in the house had become a physical presence, a third occupant that sat between Lauren and me at the breakfast table. It was no longer a lack of conversation. It was a filter. Everything that entered our lives, every phone call, every social media notification, every piece of mail passed through this heavy, quiet air and was stripped of its pretense. I realized that by stopping my own output, I was finally able to hear the true frequency of the world around me. And the frequency of Oak Ridge was a high-pitched, desperate hum of insecurity. I stayed silent during the Tuesday morning rush because I wanted to see the cracks in the armor. Lauren was on the phone with Stephanie, her voice hitting that forced, melodic register she used when she was trying to sound like her life was a curated magazine spread. But through the filter of my silence, I heard the strain. I heard the way Stephanie's voice on the other end was sharper than usual, more demanding. Stephanie was losing her grip on something, and she was using Lauren as an anchor. I sipped my coffee, watching the steam rise, and I understood that I was the only person in the room who wasn't panicking. That was the moment I understood that silence isn't just a lack of noise, it's a weapon of observation. Because I didn't engage in the neighborhood gossip, people began to forget I was there, even when I was standing right in front of them. At the local tennis club, I sat on the bleachers, a book in my lap, while Andrew Collins and David Harper stood 5 feet away. They were talking about the investment pool they had started, a private fund for the neighborhood elite. "Michael is out, obviously," Andrew said, his voice dripping with a casual, unearned authority. "We need people who can contribute more than just a signature. We need momentum. Lauren says he's mostly just consulting from home now. It's a shame. He used to have a real eye for the market." David nodded, his eyes scanning the court, never once looking toward the bleachers where I sat. They were discussing my financial demise as if it were a weather report. They were so confident in the narrative they had created that they didn't even check to see if the subject was listening. I stayed silent because information is only valuable when the other side thinks you don't have it. I knew exactly what investment pool they were talking about. I also knew, through a few discreet inquiries with my own contacts in the city, that the project they were backing was built on a foundation of speculative air. Andrew was over-leveraged. David was chasing a dream of status he couldn't afford. They were desperate for momentum because they were sinking. My exclusion from the group wasn't a punishment. It was a blessing. They were pushing me off a ship that was already taking on water. The psychological pressure of being socially dead is a unique sensation. It's like being a ghost who can still feel the cold. I watched Lauren prepare for a girls' weekend in Napa that I hadn't been invited to. I watched her pack her bags with a frantic energy, as if she were trying to outrun the silence in our home. She didn't ask me if I minded. She didn't even mention the cost. She just assumed I would be there when she got back, a quiet, stationary object in her life. I realized then that she didn't see me as a partner anymore. I was a utility. I was the roof over her head and the insurance policy for her reputation. I noticed the way the neighbors began to look at our house. It was no longer with envy, but with a predatory curiosity. They were waiting for the "for sale" sign. They were waiting for the collapse. In the suburbs, people don't just want you to fail. They want to be there to witness the exact moment the lights go out. I stayed calm, maintaining the property with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. I mowed the lawn. I trimmed the hedges. I repainted the front door. Every action was a signal of stability that contradicted the rumors. I was gaslighting the entire neighborhood with my competence. Status threat is most effective when it is invisible. By not reacting to their snubs, I was creating a vacuum that they felt compelled to fill. Andrew began to act more aggressively toward me when we did cross paths. He would make jokes about my retirement or ask if I needed help finding a real job. Again, I stayed silent, giving him nothing but a polite, empty smile. My lack of reaction was driving him crazy. He needed me to be angry. He needed me to be the difficult husband the rumors claimed I was. By being perfectly composed, I was making him look like the aggressor. Internal monologue. I realized that their power was entirely dependent on my participation. If I didn't accept the humiliation, it couldn't stick. I was filtering out their attempts to diminish me and turning their own energy back against them. I saw Emily Harper watching me from her window one afternoon while I was working in the garden. She looked perplexed. I was supposed to be a broken man, yet there I was, calmly planting perennials. I was a variable they couldn't solve. As the weeks passed, the filter of silence began to reveal more than just social dynamics. I began to see the financial reality of Oak Ridge. I noticed the subtle signs of a neighborhood under pressure. The delayed contractor visits, the for sale, luxury cars replaced by humbler rentals, the forced smiles at the grocery store. My silence allowed me to see the truth that their noise was designed to hide. They were all terrified. They were all one bad month away from losing the perfect life. And I was the only one with a clear view of the exit. I stood on my porch as the sun went down, the orange light catching the edges of the neighborhood. Lauren was gone. The house was empty. The silence was absolute. I felt a sense of quiet dominance. I hadn't fought a single battle, yet I was winning the war. I had moved my pieces into place without anyone hearing a sound. The neighbors thought they had isolated me, but they had actually just given me the high ground. I looked at the Collins house, where the lights were bright and the music was loud, and I realized that the loudest room is usually the most fragile. That was when the first invitation shifted. It wasn't an invitation to a party. It was a text message from David Harper sent at 11:42 p.m. on a Thursday night. It was short, desperate, and devoid of the usual neighborhood jargon. "Michael, do you have a minute tomorrow? Just between us. I think I made a mistake on the investment pool." I didn't reply. I let the message sit in the silence of the room, a digital prayer for help that I had no intention of answering yet. The filter was working. The truth was finally making its way to the surface. Section 6. Invitations start shifting. The shift began in the shadows. It wasn't a sudden return to the social inner circle. It was something far more interesting. The invitations were no longer for the Reeves. They were targeted. They were quiet. They were late-night emails and hushed conversations in the parking lot of the hardware store. The neighborhood had spent months trying to erase me, only to realize that by doing so, they had lost access to the only person who actually knew how to fix what was breaking. I noticed the change in Andrew Collins first. He stopped making the retirement jokes. He stopped leaning against my kitchen counter as if he owned it. When we met at the mailbox, his posture was different. He looked like a man who was carrying a weight he couldn't describe. He tried to engage me in a business discussion, his tone a clumsy attempt at professional respect. "Michael, I was looking at those quarterly projections for the tech sector," he said, his voice trailing off as he waited for me to finish his thought. I stayed silent. I looked at my mail, sorted through the bills and the junk, and gave him, That was the moment I understood that status is a shadow, but leverage is the sun. For months they had used their social status to cast me into the dark. But now the financial sun was shifting, and the leverage was moving into my hands. Andrew didn't want my friendship. He wanted my insight. He wanted to know if I had seen the same warning signs he was seeing. He wanted me to tell him that his investment pool wasn't a sinking ship. By refusing to speak, I was letting him drown in his own uncertainty. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how far the radiant Lauren would go to maintain her position. She had returned from Napa with a new kind of desperation. She was constantly on her phone, her thumb scrolling with a rhythmic, anxious speed. She was being invited to even more events, brunches, trunk shows, planning committees, but she was being invited as an individual, not as a wife. The neighborhood was trying to peel her away from me entirely. They thought if they could separate the asset from the liability, they could keep the asset for themselves. The psychological pressure was shifting from me to her. I watched her struggle to keep up with the demands of her friends. Stephanie Collins was calling her 4 times a day, demanding her presence at this or that. It wasn't friendship, it was recruitment. Stephanie needed Lauren's radiance to mask the growing gloom in her own household. I saw Lauren's exhaustion in the way she moved, the way she forgot to finish her meals, the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching. She was realizing that the inner sanctum was actually a cage. I realized that my endurance had turned into a form of power. Because I had survived the exclusion without breaking, the neighborhood didn't know how to categorize me. I wasn't the difficult husband anymore. I was the unknown factor. And in a community where everyone's business is public knowledge, being an unknown factor is the ultimate threat. People started adjusting their tone without even knowing why. They spoke to me with a cautious, measured politeness. It was the way people speak to a dog they aren't sure will bite. Internal monologue. I stayed silent because I wanted them to feel the weight of their own assumptions. Every time they spoke to me, and I didn't respond with the expected anger or desperation, they had to reevaluate their entire strategy. I was watching their social structure slowly dismantle itself. David Harper approached me at the gym again, but this time he didn't laugh with the other guys. He waited until they were gone. He looked at me with a raw, naked fear in his eyes. "Michael, I really need to talk to you about the Collins Fund," he whispered. "I put in more than I should have. Stephanie said it was a sure thing." "Stephanie is a very convincing woman," I replied, my voice calm and conversational. I didn't offer advice. I didn't offer a shoulder to cry on. I simply stated a fact and went back to my workout. The social imbalance was now so extreme that it was almost comical. David, the man who had mocked me a month ago, was now begging for a crumb of my attention. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply witnessing the natural consequences of their own arrogance. Invitations to the big events were still missing me, but I was starting to receive invitations to private offices and quiet lunches. A local developer, someone who usually only dealt with the heavy hitters like Andrew, reached out to me. He didn't mention the neighborhood. He didn't mention Lauren. He wanted to discuss a project in the city. He had heard that I was available and discreet. The rumors of my crisis had been transformed in the right circles into a reputation for being a man who didn't talk. And in business, a man who doesn't talk is a man you can trust with a secret. The pressure must increase, never stabilize. I decided it was time to move from passive observation to active filtering. I started making subtle changes to our home. I changed the security codes. I updated the landscaping to provide more privacy. I began to spend more time in my home office, the door closed, the sound of my work, a constant, low hum that Lauren couldn't decipher. I was creating a boundary that she couldn't cross. I was showing her and the neighborhood that my world was no longer open for inspection. Lauren came into my office one evening, her eyes red as if she had been crying.
"Everyone is talking about Andrew, Michael," she said, her voice trembling. "They say the fund is gone. Stephanie is a wreck. She wants to know if you knew."
She was looking for a lifeline. She wanted me to be the hero who would save her social circle and restore her status. She wanted the quiet husband to fix everything so she could go back to being radiant without any of the consequences. I looked at her, the woman I had built a life with, and I saw a stranger. I saw someone who had stood by while I was erased, only to come back when the erasure started to affect her. I stayed silent for a long, uncomfortable minute. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. I realized that my moral victory wasn't going to come from a confrontation. It was going to come from a choice. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the neighborhood I no longer belonged to. "I think it's time we discuss the future, Lauren," I said, my voice devoid of malice but filled with an absolute, terrifying clarity. But not Stephanie's future, ours. The look on her face was one of pure, unadulterated shock. She had spent so long worrying about the neighbor's perception that she had forgotten that the man in the house with her was the only one who actually mattered. I turned back to her, and for the first time in months, I felt like the most powerful man in Oak Ridge, not because I was included, but because I was finally, truly out. Section 7. People adjust their tone without knowing why. The air in Oak Ridge had turned brittle. It was that specific kind of American autumn where the beauty of the falling leaves felt like a curated distraction from the decay underneath. I stood in my driveway, watching a repossession truck pull away from 3 houses down. It wasn't Andrew's car, not yet. But the ripple effect of the failed investment pool was starting to tear through the neighborhood like a silent fever. People weren't just avoiding eye contact with me anymore. They were avoiding eye contact with everyone. The game of perfect lives was becoming too expensive to play. I noticed the change in Stephanie Collins during the Saturday morning joggers rush. She usually moved through the streets like she owned the pavement, her head held high, a vision of athletic suburban grace. Today, she was walking. Her shoulders were hunched, and she was staring at her phone with a focused, frantic intensity. When she saw me, she didn't pivot away. She stopped. She actually waited for me to approach. The hierarchy had collapsed so completely that she was willing to bridge the gap she had spent months widening. "Michael," she said, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the morning air, "we haven't seen you at the club lately." There was no bite in her words, no hidden insult. It was a tentative, almost desperate reach for normalcy. She was searching my face for any sign of the difficult man the rumors had created. Instead, she found only the same calm, unreadable mask I had worn since the beginning. I stayed silent for a beat too long, letting the sound of a distant leaf blower fill the space between us. I wanted her to feel the weight of the air. "I've been busy, Stephanie," I finally replied. I didn't elaborate. I didn't ask how she was. I didn't mention Andrew or the fund. The internal monologue in my head was a cold, clear stream. I realized that her power was never hers. It was just a reflection of the collective agreement to believe her lies. Now that the money is gone, the agreement is void. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw her as she truly was, a terrified woman who had traded her soul for a zip code that no longer wanted her. I noticed that the tone people used with me had shifted from pity to a strange, subconscious deference. At the local deli, the manager, who usually joked loudly with Andrew and ignored me, suddenly became very attentive. He brought my order to the table himself. He lowered his voice, speaking to me with the kind of hushed respect usually reserved for judges or grieving billionaires. He didn't know why he was doing it. He just sensed that the power dynamic in the neighborhood had flipped. I was the one with a steady hand while everyone else was shaking. Psychological pressure is a fascinating tool when you aren't the one being squeezed. I watched Lauren try to navigate this new reality. She was caught in a social pincer movement. Her friends were begging her for information about my secret stability while simultaneously resenting her for it. She would come home and sit in the living room without turning on the lights, her face illuminated only by the glow of her phone. She was waiting for me to say something, to offer a solution, a bank account, a way out. I stayed silent. I was the filter through which her desperation had to pass. I realized that by doing nothing, I had become the most influential man in the neighborhood. David Harper stopped by later that evening, ostensibly to return a lawn aerator he had borrowed months ago. He didn't even have the tool with him. He just stood on my porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking like a man who was about to ask for a kidney. "Michael, I just wanted to apologize," he stammered, "for the talk, for the jokes." We were all just caught up in Andrew's energy. I looked at David, noticing the fine lines of stress around his eyes and the way his expensive watch seemed too heavy for his wrist. "Energy is a volatile thing, David," I said quietly. I didn't accept the apology. I didn't reject it. I simply let it hang there in the cool evening air, a useless piece of social debris. He stayed for another 5 minutes, talking about nothing, waiting for me to give him some sign of hope. I gave him a polite nod and closed the door. The psychological dominance was absolute. I didn't need to hurt them, I just needed to let them be themselves. The social imbalance was now a visible fracture. During the Sunday morning church service, the ultimate stage for Oak Ridge's moral theater, the seating had changed. The Collins were in the back row. The Harpers weren't there at all. Lauren and I sat in our usual spot, but the space around us had grown. No one dared to sit in the pews immediately behind or in front of us. It was as if we were surrounded by an invisible barrier of competence and survival. People adjusted their tone, their posture, and their walking paths to avoid disturbing the ghost who had outlasted them all. Internal monologue. I stayed silent because any word I spoke would be interpreted as a sentence. If I was kind, they would think I was weak. If I was cruel, they would think I was vengeful. By being nothing, I was everything they feared, a witness. I watched the pastor give a sermon about temporal riches, and I saw Stephanie Collins wipe a tear from her cheek. It wasn't a tear of repentance, it was a tear of loss. She wasn't sorry for what she had done to me. She was sorry that she couldn't do it anymore. As we walked out into the bright Sunday sun, Andrew Collins was waiting by my car. He looked older. The bravado was gone, replaced by a hollow, frantic energy. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at my chest, his voice a low, desperate mumble. "Michael, I need a bridge loan. Just 2 weeks. I know you moved your accounts. I know you have the liquidity." He was begging. In front of the entire congregation, the alpha of Oak Ridge was pleading with the man he had tried to erase. I stood there, the sun warming my back, and I felt the eyes of the entire neighborhood on us. Lauren was frozen beside me, her breath hitching in her throat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where I would step in and save her world. I looked at Andrew, really looked at him, and saw the decades of entitlement and casual cruelty that had led him to this spot. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound, peaceful indifference. I stayed silent for a long, agonizing minute, and then I did something that broke the last of their hold on me. I simply smiled, got into my car, and drove away. Section 8. What social power looks like when you no longer need approval. The final transformation of Oak Ridge happened not with a bang, but with a series of quiet exits. The moving trucks became a permanent fixture of the landscape. The Collins house went into foreclosure 3 weeks after Andrew's public breakdown. The Harpers moved to a smaller condo in the city, citing a desire for a simpler life. The narrative of the perfect marriage and the perfect neighborhood had finally collapsed under the weight of its own lies. I stood on my back deck, the air cold and clean, feeling the silence of the neighborhood as a profound relief. Lauren was still there, but she was a different person. The radiance had been replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. She had stopped going to the club. She had stopped answering Stephanie's calls. She spent her days in the garden, her hands covered in dirt, looking at the earth as if she were trying to find something she had buried a long time ago. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't talk about the betrayal. We lived in a house of shared secrets, but for the first time in our marriage, the air felt honest. I stayed silent because I realized that my victory wasn't in the destruction of my enemies, but in my complete detachment from their opinions. I didn't need Andrew's respect. I didn't need Stephanie's inclusion. I didn't even need Lauren's validation. I had found a version of myself that existed outside of their metrics. I was a man who could stand in a room of people who hated him and feel nothing but a mild curiosity. That is the ultimate social power, the power of being truly, unbreakably alone. I noticed the way the new families moving into the neighborhood looked at me. They had heard the stories, of course, the filtered, distorted versions of what had happened during the Great Collapse. They saw me as a figure of quiet authority, a survivor who had navigated the storm without losing his house or his dignity. They spoke to me with a genuine respect that was never forced. They didn't know the full story, and I would never tell them. I realized that my reputation was now built on a foundation of silence, and that made it more durable than anything built on noise. Internal monologue. I understood that true authority is never loud. It doesn't need to defend itself. It just is. I watched Lauren walk across the lawn toward me, her face soft in the twilight. She didn't look like a prize anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally realized that the stage she had been performing on was empty. She sat down next to me, and for a long time, we just watched the stars come out over the darkened houses of Oak Ridge. There was no social pressure. There was no status threat. There was just the two of us and the truth. "I'm sorry, Michael," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. It was the first time she had said it. It wasn't a public apology. It wasn't for the neighbors. It was for her. I looked at her, and for the first time in a year, I felt a flicker of the old warmth. I didn't need her to grovel. I didn't need her to explain. I just needed her to know that I knew. I stayed silent, but I reached out and took her hand. It was a gesture of restrained, dignified closure. We were starting over, but this time the rules would be mine. I realized that the moral victory I had sought wasn't about being right. It was about being free. I had been a prisoner of their expectations, and I had used their own cruelty to pick the lock. The neighborhood was no longer a stage for me. It was just a place where I lived. I moved my business entirely to the city, working from a quiet office with a view of the river. I didn't need the local power brokers to find me work. My silence had become my brand, a sign of a man who could handle the most delicate matters without making a sound. The final closure came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at the grocery store and I saw Stephanie Collins. She was working behind the floral counter. She was wearing a green apron, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She didn't look like the Queen of Oak Ridge anymore. She looked like a woman who was tired. She saw me, and for a moment the old fear flashed in her eyes. I didn't look away. I didn't gloat. I simply walked up to the counter and ordered a bouquet of lilies. I stayed silent as she wrapped the flowers, her hands trembling slightly. I watched the way she avoided my gaze, the way she focused on the ribbons with a desperate, professional intensity. She was waiting for me to say something, to mention the club, the house, the money. I didn't. I paid for the flowers, gave her a small, polite tip, and turned to leave. I had reached the point where I no longer needed to see her pain to feel my own peace. As I walked out into the parking lot, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The world of Oak Ridge would continue to spin, new stories would be written, and new, perfect lives would be curated. But I was no longer a character in those stories. I was the author of my own. I got into my car, the scent of the lilies filling the space, and I drove home to a house that was finally, truly my own. The silence wasn't the burden anymore. It was the music of a life lived on its own terms. What social power looks like when you no longer need approval is remarkably simple. It looks like a man standing on his porch in the early morning, watching the world wake up. It looks like a husband and wife sharing a meal without a single word of pretense. It looks like the ability to say no without providing an excuse. I had survived the humiliation, the betrayal, and the silence. And in doing so, I had found the only thing that actually mattered, the dignity of a man who no longer needs to be seen to know he exists. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.